Welcome to Episode 6 of The Crisis, a day-by-day account of Britain's 1931 crisis brought to you 90 years on. As we learned last time, after many hours of discussion, the government's Cabinet Economy Committee of 5 had agreed to proposals for tax rises of $88.5 million and spending cuts of $78.6 million in order to balance the budget. However, there were already cracks beginning to show in the Labour leadership about unemployment benefit and tariffs. Wednesday, the 19th of August, would see their proposals submitted for the consideration of the full cabinet of 21 ministers. The intention was that the cabinet would agree to a budget program that could then be put to the wider party and movement, as well as the opposition leaders, the following day. Meeting at 11 a.m., the cabinet conference would last for 9 hours. After breaks for lunch and dinner, they did not rise until 10:25 p.m. First, the assembled ministers were shocked to learn of the seriousness of the crisis, not least the revelation that the budget deficit they were aiming to plug was in fact £170 million. The cabinet as a whole, however, accepted MacDonald's formula of equal sacrifice, and only one minister opposed the idea of any cuts. It seems that agreement over the massive program of tax rises was fairly easy to find, except over tariffs. 4 of the big 5 in the Economy Committee had backed a 10% revenue tariff on imports, but Chancellor of the Exchequer Philip Snowden had objected then, and he strenuously continued to reject any compromise of his free trade principles. A vote was held, and either 15 of the cabinet of 21 supported a revenue tariff as a last resort to save cuts to the unemployed, but the minority included Snowden. Given MacDonald was not willing to sack Snowden in the middle of the crisis, the Chancellor could effectively veto the proposal. Furthermore, it was rightly pointed out that the Liberal Party, which the government's majority rested upon, would object to a tariff. There was also controversy over cuts, specifically the £48.5 million worth of savings the Economy Committee had identified to come from unemployment benefits. The cabinet was divided over £20 million that was to be saved from transitional benefit, and so it was agreed that the issue would be referred to a subcommittee of 4, including President of the Board of Trade Willie Graham, Health Minister Arthur Greenwood, Minister of Labour Margaret Bondfield, and Tom Johnston. As for Snowden's favoured 10% cut in the rate of the unemployment benefit, Henderson and Graham made it clear that they opposed it. It was, after all, not part of the programme of £78 million worth of cuts. By the time the cabinet rose late into the night, agreement remained a long way off. So far, the cabinet had agreed to £56.25 million worth of cuts, signing up to the Economy Committee's proposals for cuts to teachers' pay, the road fund, £25.5 million worth of savings from the unemployment insurance fund, although not a cut in the rate of the benefit. The failure to agree a program was highly problematic for the following day, Thursday, the 20th of August. Not only would the cabinet have to sit again to try and iron out the remaining issues, but MacDonald and the other leaders already had a packed schedule. They were to meet the opposition leaders at 10 a.m., the Consultative Committee of the Parliamentary Labour Party, representatives of the backbenchers, at 11 a.m., and then both the General Council of the Trades Union Congress, the TUC, and the Labour Party's executive, the NEC, at 3 p.m. The aim, of course, had been to present the opposition, the party, and the trade unions with a definite program and to request their support, but that program did not yet exist. At 10 a.m. at 10 Downing Street, the marathon day began when MacDonald, Snowden, and Thomas met representatives of the Liberal and Conservative parties. It might be remembered that the Liberal leader Lloyd George was unwell, and Conservative leader Stanley Baldwin had resumed his holiday in France. Therefore, acting leader Herbert Samuel, as well as Sir Don McLean, represented the Liberals, and Neville Chamberlain and Sir Samuel Hoare were present for the Tories. The Conservatives learnt for the first time about the £170 million deficit. Snowden informed them of the plan for £78 million worth of cuts, referring to the proposals of the Cabinet Economy Committee. The Labour leaders did not mention the £56 million figure the cabinet had so far agreed to, although this is understandable. Cabinet discussions were ongoing, and MacDonald and Snowden were bound by cabinet secrecy, and indeed political expediency, not to reveal the full battle raging in the Labour cabinet to the opposition. On the other hand, they were probably indiscreet in revealing, in so many words, that they were not satisfied by the £78 million. Chamberlain was aghast at the economies proposed. The May report had demanded £96 million worth of cuts to address a budget deficit of £120 million. Now, he was being told the deficit was £50 million worse, but the government's cuts were going to be lighter. The opposition leaders also expressed dismay that the biggest expense, unemployment benefit, was to be left untouched. How was it equal sacrifice that public sector workers were facing hefty pay cuts, but the unemployed did not? According to Chamberlain, quote, "In effect, the Prime Minister and Snowden gave us to understand that they quite agreed, the latter saying that if you took into account both the fall in the cost of living and the rise in the benefits, the unemployed were 36% better off than in 1924. MacDonald and Snowden came away from the conference in a difficult position. The opposition parties had made clear they considered the £78 million inadequate, but the cabinet was currently stuck at £56 million, and it would be difficult to get them even up to 78, never mind 96 or £100 million. Without opposition support, no budget package would pass Parliament, and the Labour government would surely be brought down. More immediately, a package that lacked opposition support would not solve the confidence crisis or stem the run on the pound. As the conference with the opposition overran by about half an hour, MacDonald and Thomas had to flit between it and the 11 a.m. meeting with the Cabinet Economy Committee and the Consultative Committee of the Parliamentary Labour Party, a representative group of 7 backbench Labour MPs. MacDonald informed his party colleagues of the latest news, that the opposition was demanding deeper cuts, especially a reduction in the dole. The Labour backbenchers expressed deep concern about the May report recommendations and predicted a major revolt against spending cuts. Henderson, the consummate party manager, was the key figure in this meeting, and he persuaded the backbenchers to essentially support the cabinet, quote, in every way possible, winning them around by insisting he was fighting for them against even deeper sacrifices. He also assured them that there would be no cuts in the rate of unemployment benefit, despite the fact this is precisely what the opposition was demanding. Clearly, MacDonald would have serious difficulties in bringing his own party with him to support a program that had any chance of getting through the House of Commons. Then, at 3 p.m., the divide became even deeper. The Cabinet Economy Committee went to the TUC's headquarters at Transport House for a joint meeting with the party executive and the trade union leaders. The meeting lasted an hour, but was acrimonious. Snowden explained the financial crisis and the government's response, detailing the proposals for spending cuts and tax rises the cabinet was considering and the idea of equal sacrifice. In a highly contentious moment, Snowden, when questioned, said, quote, that a cut in unemployment benefit was not a part of the government's proposals. This was technically true. The issue had been too controversial to settle, so had been left out of the £78 million proposals the Economy Committee had submitted to the cabinet the previous day. But of course, Snowden believed a 10% cut in the dole was necessary, and the opposition parties were demanding it. The Labour figures present in the meeting later claimed Snowden had deceived them by saying there would be no cut in the dole, when that was exactly what he would be advocating very soon. Snowden later defended himself, saying he had not intended to mislead. The TUC General Counsel, under the influence of the up-and-coming Ernest Bevin of the Transport Workers Union, questioned the very nature of the crisis, and Bevin even accused MacDonald of whipping up financial panic in his statements to the press. It was clear from the tenor of the meeting that the TUC was not likely to support the government in balancing the budget. MacDonald asked that the TUC General Counsel come to Downing Street at 9:30 p.m. that evening to discuss the matter further, given agreement remained a long way off. The Labour cabinet met at 8:30 p.m. following their 9-hour conference the day before. Remember, the 9-hour cabinet of the previous day had agreed to £56 million of cuts so far, but had not signed up to the £78 million the Cabinet Economy Committee of 5 had recommended. However, that £78 million itself had been rejected by the opposition. The ministers were told of the negative outcomes of the various meetings that day, most pertinently the demands of the opposition for deeper cuts on the one hand, and the TUC's objection to the cuts on the other. MacDonald told his colleagues that far from being satisfied by the £78 million worth of savings the cabinet was working towards, Chamberlain had told him he wanted £100 million, not least a cut in the dole. Willie Graham, president of the Board of Trade, meanwhile told his colleagues that he had dined privately with Liberal acting leader Herbert Samuel, who had conveyed the details of that day's meeting to David Lloyd George. The agreed line of the Liberal leaders was to demand more cuts, including in the rate of the unemployment benefit. Furthermore, the party was firmly opposed to a revenue tariff. The Conservative objections were worrying, but given the Labour government's survival relied on the Liberals in Parliament, this revelation must have been a hammer blow. It appeared that the cabinet had no choice but to consent to far more severe cuts than the £56 million that had so far been agreed, or face a vote of no confidence whenever Parliament reconvened. To make matters worse, the four-person working party that had been tasked with looking at transitional benefit on the 19th reported to the cabinet that they had found £4 million worth of savings, a far cry from the $20 million which had been a crucial part of the Cabinet Economy Committee's £78 million program. Snowden, surely frustrated by this stage, simply said this was far short of what was needed. The cabinet then broke up again for the day. The trade union leaders, led by the TUC's General Secretary Walter Citron, arrived at Downing Street at 9:30 p.m. for their second conference of the day with the PM. Since the Labour ministers had left them at 4, the TUC General Council had debated the government's proposals for 4 hours before it was decided they would oppose Labour's entire programme. The TUC would oppose all cuts, and, under Bevan's influence, had come up with a radical alternative policy. The trade unionists' proposals were as follows. 1. Replacement of the unemployment insurance scheme by a graduated levy upon the whole community, based on capacity to pay, effectively scrapping the contributions made by employers and employees to support the unemployed with a new tax to pay for the dole. 2. To suspend the sinking fund, which was £50 million set aside each year to pay off the national debt. 3. A new tax on all fixed-interest securities. And 4. A revenue tariff on imports. MacDonald, after the longest and most difficult of days, was apparently in a mood of furious despair in this meeting, as the TUC not only defied him and his government, but promised to oppose it unless they adopted a completely different policy. No cuts in expenditure, only new taxes, presumably on a massive scale, with the only saving coming from not paying off the national debt. Clearly, this ran contrary to all the advice MacDonald and Snowden had received. Whether or not it would have balanced the books or helped or hindered Britain's recovery from the Depression, what we can say is that announcing such a program would have almost certainly exacerbated the run on the pound and would definitely not have got through Parliament, leading to the inevitable fall of the Labour government. Understandably, MacDonald would not countenance it. Indeed, he rightly considered it, quote, practically a declaration of war. He told the trade unionists that the proposals they had put forward failed to address the actual problems the government was facing. The trade unionists, for their part, had no expectation that MacDonald would adopt their approach. They had given up on the second Labour government and believed its collapse was imminent. In such circumstances, they preferred to precipitate the collapse themselves rather than compromise their principles, and thereby leave themselves in a stronger position in the Labour movement going forward. Henderson remained silent throughout, but his position was likely shifting. It was he who had insisted on scheduling these consultations with the party and the unions, and had also insisted that the spending cuts discussed at the Cabinet Economy Committee were merely tentative proposals, not definite policy. Now that he had sounded out the wider Labour movement, it was clear to Henderson that the entire unity of the Labour Party was at stake. If the TUC had accepted the cuts, Henderson almost certainly would have too. But now that it was clear that the government's program would face massive opposition from the Labour movement, Henderson's position was therefore about to shift. His priority now was saving the Labour Party, knowing that would mean the end of the government. A program that was acceptable to the movement would be unacceptable to Parliament. MacDonald and Snowden, meanwhile, were determined to save the government and confront the crisis. Party political concerns were secondary to balancing the budget and saving the pound. This was the real way to serve the working class, and indeed the whole nation. This fundamental philosophical divide about what was more important, the movement or government, rank-and-file opinion or financial reality, would be the crux of the fateful divisions that would tear the Labour cabinet apart over the next few days. Thanks so much for watching episode 6 of The Crisis. If you like what we're doing, consider dropping a like because it really helps us out, and if you aren't already, consider subscribing to never miss another episode. As always, we'd like to thank our patrons, including our executive producers, Eustace Abel, Jeremy Marcoux, Tom McCool, and Tony Chirin, for helping to support the show. Thanks so much, and see you in the next episode.